towards the book of Genesis, go back to Ruth. There's Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And we're in chapter 2, looking at verses 4 through 17. Chapter 2, verses 4 through 17. This whole section here is speaking of the generosity of Boaz. Last week we looked at verses 1, 2, and 3. It was sort of an introduction to the whole chapter. Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And that's all the author says at that point. So the author has given us, the readers, just a little bit of tidbit here. There's something that's going to take place. So he tells us about Naomi, who had a kinsman of the family of Elimelech, and his name. And then he picks up in verse 2 and says, Ruth said to Naomi, let me go and glean. They need to eat. They're widows, both of them are widows, and they have the option of going to glean in fields. And so Ruth politely asks Naomi if she can go and glean among the fields. So verse 3, she departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, this man that they mentioned in verse 1, who was of the family of Elimelech. And that's the way the writer leaves it. So we're alerted that there's something going on. We're not going to hear this is not the end of Naomi. We're going to hear more about her and more about what the Lord is going to do with her and with Ruth. Now, this long section in verses 4 through 17, verses 4 through the first part of verse 17, is divided into two episodes. You have verses 4 through 13, first of all. Verses 4 through 13, it's almost entirely a conversation between Boaz and his workers. That's in verses 4 through 7. And then almost entirely a conversation between Boaz and Ruth. That's in verses 8 through 13. So that's the way this section, verses 4 through 13, you have a conversation between Boaz and his workers, verses 4 through 7, and then 8 through 13 is Boaz and Ruth. The absence of action here serves to increase the suspense for us, the readers. We already know Boaz's identity in verse 1, and that he must have a role in the resolution of the problem of the book. You have two widows, and there's no heir to carry on the name of Elimelech. So we have this information. We have Boaz's identity. We know that somehow he must play a role in this. And then the second episode, in verses 14 through 16, is a mix of conversation by Boaz and action by Ruth. So a long section here, and we'll look at verses 4 through 7 tonight and maybe get into a little bit of verses 8 and following. Probably verses 8 and 9 we'll get into. We can do that. And then next week I'm not going to be here. I'm going to go visit Johnny in San Diego. So Sergey is going to be preaching Sunday morning on Hebrews 12. And then Jason is going to be preaching Sunday night on Psalm 65? 34. Where did I get 65 from? Psalm 34. So be reading up on Psalm 34. Get a little bit of a head start. What it's talking about, who's writing it, what's the occasion, all these other kind of things, and that will help. So I know that you will be an encouragement to both Sergey and Jason next week as they bring the Word of God. First episode, verses 4 through 7, Boaz and the foreman. So let's read that, verses 4 through 7. Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? The servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And she said, this is the helper telling Boaz what she said. She said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from the morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. So you have the conversation between Boaz and his workers here, his foreman, in verses 4 through 7. Now, the section follows narrative. It follows storyline that presented a brief summary and preview of the whole scene. Where did that happen? That happened in verse 3. She departed, gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. So you had a little bit of a brief summary there in verse 3. Ruth is in the field gleaning when Boaz arrives in verse 4. She's already doing that in verse 4. Now, how long was she there before Boaz arrived? We don't really know. One commentator suggests that Boaz arrived a short while, if not several hours, after Ruth. That's what he says. That's Ron Hubbard, not L. Ron Hubbard, but another Hubbard. Never mind, don't say anything. The construction here simply leaves the time interval unexpressed. We don't know how long she had been there. And it's if we, of course, we're curious and we want to know all the details we can about this, but the text just doesn't give us all the details that we would like to have. It's clear that Ruth is gleaning when Boaz arrives, but it does not express any kind of chronological sequence. So this factor is clear. Enough time had elapsed for the foreman, in verse 7, to form an opinion of Ruth after her arrival. Enough time had elapsed for the foreman to form an opinion of Ruth after her arrival. Bottom line, in the providence of God, Ruth got there before the time of Boaz's arrival. And then we have what the text says in verse 4, now behold. You see that? Now behold. And the introduction is a genius of the author. It's a genius of the author. There is an element of surprise or satisfaction here that we see. In Ruth, this word, now behold, is used in three ways. Three ways. One, in direct conversation as emphatic, registering a surprise or attention. And you see that in chapter 1 and verse 15. Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back. There's surprise or attention there. Another way this is used is as an indicator of point of view. In other words, the perspective from which an event or character is viewed. The perspective from which a character or an event is viewed. And you see an example of that in chapter 3 and verse 8. Chapter 3 and verse 8. It happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. So there's the perspective from an event or a character, how he was surprised. Well, the third way that this word is used is the example here in chapter 2 and verse 4. It does not have a chronological function, but rather it expresses the abrupt or unexpected way in which the new fact is introduced into the narrative. So you have in their English text, now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. So it's expressing here an abrupt or unexpected way. The reader's curiosity has already been piqued in verse 1 because we hear of this guy by the name of Boaz. We know nothing about him, with the introduction of he and his family in connection with Elimelech. How's this going to work out? Verse 4, now behold, Boaz came. Oh, Boaz is coming back into the scene now. All we've known about Naomi and Ruth is that Ruth wants to go glean. But now we find it out, now behold, she went to the field and then Boaz showed up after her. Furthermore, Ruth requests to glean in someone's field. Verse 2, it says, in whose sight I may find favor. Is what he says. Or what she says. And finally, the information in verse 3, she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz. What that does is it shoves us, the readers, over the edge of anxiety. All of this is coming together rather quickly. A challenge is to capture this in the translation. The phrase, wouldn't you know it? Of course, or imagine that Boaz came from Bethlehem to the very field Ruth is gleaning, would seem to capture the meaning here, is what the author is writing. So we know about Naomi, who had a kinsman. Ruth asked to glean in verse 2. And verse 3, she happened to come to a portion of the field belonging to Boaz. Now behold, wouldn't you know it, that Boaz shows up too. That's what the writer is doing. It would be a wonderful story for kids. Those of you that like to give stories to kids, here it is. Wouldn't you know it? Guess who shows up? And they all raise their hands. Boaz. You're right. Wouldn't you know it? Boaz shows up. Well, that's what the writer is saying here in verse 4. That's what he's saying. So Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "May the Lord be with you." And they said to him, "May the Lord bless you." So Boaz enters the scene as a benevolent man. Israelites normally greeted one another with a simple shalom, which means peace to you. This greeting may have been a special greeting given at harvest time. It's possible, we don't know. Boaz was in effect saying, "May the Lord prosper all your efforts with the bountiful harvest." That's what he was saying. It both greeted and blessed. That term shalom did. It greeted and it blessed and encouraged the workers that God was with them. And in this regard, Boaz is a model of true covenant loving kindness for all who supervised others in their work. Here you have a man this was his field, these are his workers, and he's greeting his workers with shalom, may the Lord be with you. And they respond with, may the Lord bless you. And that's a great relationship. That's not a who's not here? Why didn't you guys got this done yet? That kind of greeting presents Boaz as an extremely benevolent, kind man. That's the picture that we're getting of him. So this term, greeted and blessed, it encouraged the workers, it encouraged them and it reminded them that God was with them. And there's, based on their response to him, or based upon his character, there's little wonder that his workers responded with the blessing. And their response reflects the reputation of Boaz. This is a good man. And his men who work for him know that he's a good man. And you note that the term Lord, capital L-O-R-D, is used twice in the greeting. Now, therefore, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to them, "May Yahweh be with you." And they said to him, "May Yahweh bless you," twice in the greeting. So the author gives some insight on the invisible hand of God orchestrating the events. The fact that Ruth happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz was not by luck, chance, fate, or simply circumstance. It is confirmed here that God is involved, perhaps off stage, but still directing the steps. Proverbs 16:9, "The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps." This is what you see happening here. One commentator says, not only does the divine hover over events, as in verse 3, but he's on the lips of great and small alike, of the man of valor as well as of his reapers. So the word of the Lord is on all of these men. So the author is conveying to us that these are godly men who love the Lord and greet one another with kindness and with the wish of blessing for them. Then Boaz immediately, evidently, notices a servant. He sees a girl that he doesn't recognize, and so he asks about her. It says in verse 5, Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" So we mentioned this last week. You want to know what he saw in her that was different. Did she have earrings, whereas Israelite women didn't have earrings? Did she have some sort of body piercing, whereas women did not? Was she wearing distinctly different clothing? The text doesn't tell us. The author gives us no reason why Ruth catches Boaz's eye. None at all. It is the presence of a new person in his field, or that is it the presence of a new person in his field, or is it something in her demeanor that attracts Boaz's attention? Do her clothes or physical features distinguish her visibly from the others? Beauty, one commentator said, beauty does not seem to be the cause. In fact, nowhere in the book do we read that Ruth is beautiful. No comment at all about the way Ruth looks is made in the book of Ruth at all. When he sees her, Boaz does not ask who, but to whom does this young woman belong? To what household does this person belong? And his assumption is that she is not independent. She must belong to someone, or she must be engaged to some landowner. The question is general because he does not know how to phrase it, since she is a stranger. You see, in Israelite society, the community to which one belonged was central to one's identity and status. I am of the house of Elimelech, or I am of the house of Samuel, whatever that might be, and you identify yourself with that family. To be a resident outside that community was to be a resident alien. A resident alien. And perhaps we'll talk about the difference between a foreigner and a resident alien, those kind of differences, because there are slight differences in those terms there. In a patriarchal world, a woman had no independent status or identity of her own. She belonged to and lived under the authority of her father when unmarried and her husband when married. And the question, to whom do you belong, was not looking at her as a piece of property. It was not demeaning in any way. It was a common one that people asked in those days. And if you go back to the Middle East, you will probably hear a very similar statement today. That's just in the tribal wandering tribes that live in that world, goats and sheep and everything else. That would be the way that they live. He says, to whom, how does he say this in verse 5? Whose young woman? Young woman. The word young woman there is a word that's used over 200 times with a wide range of usage. And you have to look at the context. And in such cases, the context is almost the sole determiner of the meaning. The word means girl, maiden, young woman, and usually refers to a marriageable but unmarried girl, emphasizing the youthfulness. So whether it's a young woman, whether it's a maiden, you have to look at the context. The context will tell you. Obviously, Ruth is marriageable. She's been married before, and her husband, Mahlon, has passed away. Just to give you an example, this term young woman can denote a little girl in 2 Kings chapter 2, marriageable young woman in Genesis 24. It can refer even to a concubine in Judges chapter 19. It can refer to a prostitute in Amos 2 and a young widow here in the book of Ruth. So the context will have to give you the understanding of that word there. So here it refers simply to a young woman. Boaz was probably inferring her young age compared to his own. There's no indication of inappropriate curiosity here or authorial intention to put questions into the reader's mind. Not at all. The word is simply the natural term for the use of an unknown young woman. And the reason I have to say all of that is because some commentators go down a rabbit trail and they imply some of these kinds of ideas. And so and if you would ever do any reading on Ruth, you likely would come across some things like that, unfortunately. So now you've heard, now you know. Don't go that route. Then he says, the writer goes on in verse 6, and the servant in charge of the reapers answered and said, she is a young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab, in verse 6. So the reputation of Ruth's faithfulness must have been known in Bethlehem. How about that? So what that means is, when you see verse 2, when you go back to verse 2, Ruth, please let me go to a field and glean, it was probably not the next day after they walked into Bethlehem for the first time after she had been gone for all these years. There probably was some time elapsed there for people to get to know her. Even this worker knew who she was. So when you look at chapter 1, verse 22, Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. And then it stops there. And then in verse 2 of chapter 2, there's all the recognition of Naomi. Welcome back, Naomi. And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Lord has dealt very bitterly with me. There's evidently some days, perhaps weeks, between chapter 1, verse 22 and chapter 2, verse 2. We don't know how much, but verse 6 would indicate to us that the servant there working under Boaz knew her. She was the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. So the reputation of Ruth's faithfulness must have been known in Bethlehem through some means. The servant was certainly aware that Ruth is a young Moabite and that she returned with Naomi. But apparently he did not know her name. That's all he says. Ruth seems to be best known by her association to Naomi, not Mahlon. He doesn't say here, the young servant doesn't say here, this is Ruth the Moabitess who was the widow of Mahlon. Doesn't say that. Her identity is now with Naomi. And that's what the author gives us the impression there. Verse 7, she said, this is what Ruth asked of me. This is the young servant speaking. Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from morning until now. All right. Think of it this way. From morning until now, until this very moment, she did not rest. That's what that means. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. In other words, she's been working. Ever since she got here, she's been working. Only recently has she been sitting in the house, is what he is saying. So he describes her work ethic in just a very short sentence. And Boaz, of course, picks up on this. So the author here, the writer here says now what happened between verses 3 and 4. What happened between verse 3 and 4? She came and requested, and she's been working all morning or all day. Only has rested recently for a little while. This happened between verses 3 and 4. So an earlier conversation Ruth had with the servant, that's what this is. She had politely asked to glean among the sheaves. The preposition there, among, can have the meaning that we have here, among, but there are major problems that arise when we understand that to be among the sheaves. The NASB says among, I believe. Verse 7. Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Do you have among in yours? Most of you do? Okay. Well, let's see about that. That preposition can have the meaning among, but major problems arise when translated among here. What do you mean? Okay. If among, the word among is the right translation, Ruth made a request very contrary to customary practice. She would be asking, if the word were among, she would be asking something rather impetuous, namely, to glean not just among the standing stalks, but also among the piles of already harvested grain. And that request goes beyond the intention of verse 2, where she says, let me glean among the ears of the grain after one in whose sight I may find favor. See, in the Old Testament, gleaning went something like this. First, the reaper would grab a handful of standing grain. And as I studied this and I read this, I thought, I remember doing the same thing with different things that we grew in Louisiana and Texas. First, the reaper grabbed a handful of standing grain with one hand, and he would cut it with the sickle in the other. This handful of cut grain was laid on the ground behind him, and these handfuls were in turn gathered into bundles by a bundler who fills his arms. And these bundles were probably then bound into sheaves. Remember the old song, bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, okay? These piles that are tied that sometimes you see in pictures of children's Bibles. So they bound them into sheaves. It's possible that the bundles and the sheaves are synonymous. It might be that they mean the same thing. The ordinary privilege of gleaning required that the gleaners work only in that part of the field in which the work of harvesting described above had been completed and the sheaves removed from the threshing floor. It would be almost unthinkable for Ruth to have requested the right to glean among the sheaves, a right of gleanage that far exceeded anything accorded by custom to native Bethlehemites. It could have caused her only the ill will and the enmity of all the other women whose circumstances had driven them also to glean. In other words, the poverty had driven them out there. Here's a Moabite woman getting privilege that we don't have. That would not go well. So the term among. Now, if that preposition is translated in or into, which is very common, then Ruth has requested to glean and gather after or behind the reapers, into bundles. What they missed is what she's asking. And that's likely the meaning here. For Ruth to request to glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers is a contradiction in terms. So it would be in or into. She requested to glean and gather behind the reapers, behind the bundles that they set up, and to pick up what they missed, is what she's saying. Now that was a lot of that you probably didn't realize, but think the among means around and in and among, but behind is probably what is better, what she means here. So attempting to make sense of this whole situation, so the following order is suggested. The following order of events is suggested. Verse 2, Ruth politely asks Naomi if she can go to the field and glean behind the reapers or among the ears of grain. The servant reports to Boaz in verse 7 that Ruth requested to glean and gather after or behind the reapers. In verse 9, we haven't got there yet, but verse 9, Boaz instructs Ruth to go after or behind them. Verse 14, and at mealtime, which implies an interval of time between the close of the conversation in verse 13 and Boaz's words to Ruth at the noon meal in verse 14. In other words, between Ruth's expression of thankfulness in verse 14 and the noon meal in verse 14, between Ruth's expression of thankfulness in verse 13 and the noon meal in verse 14, the remainder of the morning work was done. And when dinner was over, when she arose to glean, verse 15, Boaz then tells his servants, emphatically, even between the sheaves themselves, let her glean. So at that point, he had granted her something unusual. He had granted her access to the area between the sheaves. In other words, between the large piles of harvested grain. Isn't that fascinating? Now, that was an attempt to make the sense of the whole situation, and we'll cover it in a little bit of detail when we get there. But this is what's happened. She's requested to just follow all behind. What they drop and they leave behind, can I pick up? Having met Boaz and talked with him, he gave her a greater privilege. And so you know the story. She's going to go home with a bundle of grain. And Naomi's like, my daughter, what's happened? She brings all this food home. That's going to come later in chapter 2. Again, still looking ahead, verse 16, Boaz then makes clearer his intentions of generosity in verse 16 by telling his workers to intentionally, purposely that is, pull some of the stalks from the bundles and leave them lying for her to pick without effort. Now, anybody in the world can see this. He likes you. Anybody in the world can say that. Now, some young people will say, no, we're just playing. No, he likes you. Obviously, there's something there already, and we see it. He's bending over, the phrase bending over backwards to help her. So that's looking ahead. Back to verse 7, where we are at. In verse 7, please let me glean and gather after the reapers behind them, follow along behind them, as it says here, among the sheaves. Thus she came and has remained from morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. So thus, the text says, thus she came and has remained. And the verb remained usually means to stand. But why would she ask permission to come into the field and then simply stand around? One commentator, the same guy by the name of Hubbard, he suggests that the servant hesitated to give her permission either because he was offended by her request or he lacked authority to do so. The NIV, if you have an NIV, it goes a bit beyond the meaning. It says this, she went into the field and has worked steadily from morning until now. The verb is capable of meaning to remain or stay. So the servant means to tell Boaz that he did not send Ruth away, nor did she turn back to find another field or to return to Naomi. She came and has remained is his way of indicating that Ruth acted upon the implied permission that he gave. If you're wondering why, it sounds strange that a servant who has not asked permission would grant a foreigner, a Moabite girl, permission to glean in his field. There's the answer right there. She came and remained as his way of indicating that Ruth acted upon the implied permission that he gave. Again, verse 7, it continues, from the morning until now, she has been sitting in the house for a little while. And it's difficult to know whether the phrase from morning until now goes with the preceding or the following, especially since the following is virtually unintelligible. Nevertheless, most interpreters take the emphasis to be not upon remained, but upon the fact that Ruth continued working and thus did not rest from daylight until the time of this conversation between Boaz and the servant. Ruth has taken little rest. Ruth has not taken any rest. Ruth has taken only a little rest. Ruth has scarcely taken any rest. She has stopped only for a moment. All of those translations come out. Those phrases like that. The normal sense of house, she's been sitting in the house. The normal sense of house is excluded here. There could hardly have been a permanent place of living in the fields, of course. And there was no precedent anywhere in the Old Testament for translating the word as hut or shelter, as is often done. So that's the conversation between Boaz and his worker about to whom does this woman belong? And the response of the servant. Now what happens now is in verses 8 through 13, Boaz and Ruth talk a little bit. She's in the house. She's been there for a little while. Now he's going to talk to her. So the moment of truth, think of it this way. The moment of truth is now upon us. Boaz and Ruth are face to face. How would he respond to a foreigner? Will he be a bigot? Will he avoid her as much as possible, or will he rebuke her for coming into a field alone? And as we read this, you got to pretend you don't know, okay, for the moment. What's going to happen? For those, of course, who read the story for the first time, they don't know what's going to happen. What is Boaz going to do to a Moabite woman gleaning in his field? Now, that doesn't sound alarming to us, but try to put yourself in Boaz's sandals. This is the time of the judges. Moabites were not always friendly to Israelites. In fact, the Moabites were the aggressors a couple of times during that 300-year period. So they're not the best of neighbors. And here's a Moabite woman gleaning in my field, taking food away from other widows in Bethlehem and the surrounding regions. So reading this for the first time and trying to get in Boaz's sandals, we would think, wow, what's he going to do? Is he going to blow up at her? Is he going to throw her out? How's he going to respond? What happens, of course, is that Boaz proves to be worthy of the reputation that he owned. The words that come from him are saturated with compassion, grace, and generosity. He is a living example of God's loving kindness among man. That's the way the author sets him up. An example of God's loving kindness. So, verses 8 and 9. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." I think that's probably about as far as we're going to get. We'll see. So here's Boaz saying his first words to her. "Listen carefully, my daughter." Wow. He says that to her. Now, Boaz, we'll talk about this later, but Boaz is a little bit older than Ruth. And we'll talk about that because he's along the family of Elimelech, and we'll see some of the family connections. So Boaz, we might think this is a little bit of an older man marrying a younger girl. That's going to marry a younger girl. "Listen carefully, my daughter." Wonderful words. So he says to her, listen carefully. He wants her to pay careful attention. The phrase, "my daughter," is remarkable, not only because it is how Naomi saw Ruth. Chapter 1, verse 11, she refers to Ruth as her daughter. Chapter 2, verse 2 as well. But also because of Boaz's intention to break down the barriers that separate the two. The expression is not patronizing, but reflects the age difference and stems from a genuine sense of responsibility that he feels for Ruth. Though he and his foreman do not mention her name. He knows she is a Moabite, yet he offers this foreigner his protection and resources. And the formal part of the speech, in verses 8 and 9, consists of 4 basic statements. First of all, Ruth is not to go and glean in any other field. She has no need to go beyond the limits of the field of Boaz. That we see in the second part of verse 8. This is necessary since the fields in the ancient Near East were not clearly separated by visible boundaries. They didn't have barbed wire fences, like we often do, and things like that. They may have had a row of rocks. They may have had something like that would show a distinction. But he has to give this to her because the different fields were not clearly visible. The words "do not" are emphatic. He warns her, "do not" are emphatic. Since Boaz is granting her more than the ordinary rights of gleaning, she must not inadvertently glean in some other field because that owner did not give her those rights. And they would come out of the house yelling and screaming and unglued. And second of all, Ruth is commanded, you are to attach, to cling herself to Boaz's regular female servants, the last part of verse 8. That's what she is to do. Specifically, Ruth is to keep your eyes on the field which they, in other words, all the harvesters, regardless of gender, keep your eyes on the field which they reap and go after them. Them are the maids. And third, Ruth is not to worry about harassment from male workers. The second part of verse 9. When Boaz says, I have commanded, he is not referring to previous action. He did not know of Ruth's presence before he arrived. This is not when Ruth first gets there, but now he gives her additional instruction. I have commanded them, so he's told them. Nor does the statement refer to Boaz's command in verse 15. Verse 15, we'll look down. When she arose to glean, Boaz commanded his servant, saying, let her glean among the sheaves. This is not that. This is an earlier command. So he's commanded his people. It says in verse 9, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. Okay, he's protecting her. That's what he's doing. So it's not the command in verse 15. That's another one. The verbs are different, and the time gap is clearly implied between what happens here and what happens in verse 15. What he's saying here is, I am herewith ordering, or surely I am commanding. That's the idea, is what he says here. And the word touch, you'll note that he says, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. The word touch can mean to strike violently, to injure, or to trouble, molest, or interfere with. The word can mean either of those, to strike violently or to interfere, to trouble, or molest. In 2 Samuel 4:10, Jeremiah 12:14, you have the trouble or molest or interfere with sense there. The latter sense of harass, mistreat, and take advantage of is the best sense. With such unusual permission, especially to a foreigner, Ruth is to be careful to stay in Boaz's field, and he commanded his workers not to harass or mistreat her, is what he's saying. This is not, don't rape her, don't take advantage of her. He's not saying that. This is a godly man. This godly man would not allow that to take place among any of the women. But he's commanding her, perhaps because she is a Moabite woman, and the workers would get out there and they would start, perhaps the women as well, would start kind of turning their nose up at her and picking up more, gleaning more than they had before, and to spite her so that she would have less to pick up. Maybe they're doing that. So it's unusual permission, especially to a foreigner, but she is to be careful to stay in his field, and he commands them, his workers, don't harass or mistreat her. Presumably, there will be others gleaning who are Israelites and potentially territorial, quote unquote, in their actions. She is afforded protection thus from his own workers and others who may be gleaning. So Boaz certainly unintentionally instituted the first sexual harassment policy in the workplace in the Bible. There it is. Fourth, we said there's the first has four basic statements, verses 8 and 9. First, Ruth is not to go and glean in any of the field. Second, Ruth is commanded, you are to. Third, Ruth is not to worry about harassment from the male workers. And fourth, Ruth may drink freely of the water, not the wine, freely of the water that is provided for Boaz's regular field workers in the last part of verse 9. In a cultural context in which normally foreigners would draw for Israelites and women would draw for the men, Boaz, his authorization here of Ruth to drink from water his men had drawn is extraordinary. You remember Genesis 24 when Eliphaz, I remember his name, went to look for a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac. And the daughters came out, and they would draw water for the animals and draw water for the men. It was the women. But his authorization here to drink from the water that the men drew is extraordinary. Again, we need to get into Boaz's sandals and the cultural sandals to understand the unusual statements that are made here. This is pretty unusual. You can think, maybe you can come up with a cultural equivalent of wow, you just don't do that kind of thing. It's getting to the point where it would be like you are commanded to open the door for the women when they come through here. That's almost taboo. I mean, I remember doing that a few years ago, and the woman said, I can open my own door. So I slammed it. No, I didn't. But it's that kind of thing. It's just very unusual to do. Then she fell on her face. Let's see, verse 11. Okay, verse 10. Then hearing all of this, she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Verse 10. So Ruth's response to Boaz's generosity is an act usually reserved for deity and royalty. She fell on her face. She dropped to her knees and touched her forehead to the ground, is what she did. And you see that. If you see that in pictures of Middle Eastern people. They will do that often. This gesture illustrates the biblical understanding of worship. It illustrates that. The word used here occurs only here in the book of Ruth. Only here. Obviously, the gesture was performed in less significant context, as in a greeting or a mark of respect, Genesis 23:7, or an expression of gratitude in Genesis 48:12. But this is the external sign of the inner spirit. You can see her reaction. It reflected her heart. She was genuinely humbled by what Boaz was saying to her. So both Ruth's action and the accompanying words show that she is very surprised at what Boaz has said to her, showing that he must have granted her far more than she had requested. He's gone well beyond what she asked for. She is apparently sensitive about her alien status. She says, since I am a foreigner, she recognizes I have no rights necessarily. I'm not going to try to claim any rights. Now, we know in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, God has already instructed Israel to care for the foreigner and care for the alien, because you were aliens once in the land of Egypt. And I cared for you, so you show that same kindness to them. But she's humbled, and her status of being a foreigner makes Boaz's words to her even that much more remarkable. So she finds it a bit difficult to believe Boaz is indifferent to her being a Moabite. And in light of chapter 4, verse 10, where Boaz identifies Ruth as the wife of Mahlon, it's important to note that there is no indication in this passage that she has the status of the wife of Mahlon. She doesn't have that status. There's no indication of seeing that status here. And then Boaz is going to answer her, but that's as far as I got. And he's going to answer her in verse 11. All that you have done for your mother-in-law, and after the death of your husband, has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people you did not previously know. He is astounded by her devotion to her mother-in-law. As it should have been, the character of each one generates interest in the other. It's a character. It's a character in Boaz that generates interest from Naomi. It's the character of Naomi that generates interest in Boaz. Any questions? Lord, thank you for your blessings. Thank you for this story.